Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Jacob Shapiro. Elohim Monard joins us on the podcast again. As a reminder, I support Eloh's Spanish language politics, bringing this sort of analysis to Latin America, to South America, to Spanish speakers. So if you want to practice your Spanish, or if you're somebody who speaks Spanish and wants that analysis, you should go check out his podcast page. We've got a link in the show notes. We recorded October 30th, but of course you will hear this on October the 31st. So happy Halloween for those of you who celebrate. I have to confess, I didn't care much about Halloween until I had kids. And now my 3-year-old wants to go trick-or-treating as Princess Tiana and says I have to go as a frog. And it may surprise you, but I'm incredibly excited to do it. So that's what I'll be doing. I'm incredibly grateful that the New Orleans weather has cooled off finally so that I won't be sweating my butt off as I walk around uptown New Orleans in a frog costume. So with that image in mind, I hope you enjoy this episode. If you want to email me about the podcast, it's jacob@jacobshapiro.com. You can also email me there for any book recommendations, potential inquiries about speaking events, or anything else that I do. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love and trick or treat with them. Cheers and see you out there. All right, listeners, if you're watching on YouTube, Elo just cracked open a Coca-Cola, and I was joking, there is no greater sign of American empire than Coca-Cola. And Elo, what did you say?
If Coca-Cola was a startup right now, nobody would place a cent for it. But this is an example of how history matters for companies.
Well, you should know that the original Coca-Cola, of course, actually had cocaine in it. So it was literally a drug and addictive, which also dovetails nicely. So, and if you look at cocaine sales right now, if Coca-Cola went back to the original formula, maybe they would put something in there.
And you could also argue that that cocaine would not be illegal if was not the USA campaign all across the world to ban it. So, which brings the question of the impacts of that in the world and within the US and on the conversation that we will have today.
Yeah, so it's actually the perfect place to start the conversation in some ways. Elo, the thing I'm honestly worried about the most is that we have so much to get through and we can't talk forever. And I thought about starting micro and starting with Peru and Argentina's midterm elections and Bolivia's elections. Chile has elections coming up. I mean, if you actually start to look closely, it looks like there's actually some tectonic shifts. I hate using that trite popularism, but it feels like the ground is moving beneath us. But I think we have to begin with Venezuela and with what the United States is doing with Venezuela, because you and I have been texting back and forth about this for weeks. I would describe the tenor of those texts. Let me know if you would disagree with this as, what the heck is the Trump administration doing? Why is this happening? I think you have a cynical view of why. I will try to play devil's advocate and bring out some other views. I should also say this really harkens back to early U.S. imperial history. And that's one of the themes of the Trump administration's foreign policy for me. A lot of the things that the Trump administration is doing are unfamiliar to an observer. If you're not familiar with U.S. foreign policy history from roughly the 1890s to the 1930s, but it would be perfectly suited for what happened around then. And even this dispute with Venezuela, you could go as far back as you want. I would really start to date it around the late 1800s, really the 1890s, when Britain and Venezuela have a diplomatic spat over what is then British Guiana. And this, by the way, this dispute is still alive. Because a bunch of oil was discovered in Guyana recently, and Venezuela has held since the 19th century that land belongs to them. The United States intervened in 1895 and said, hey, Britain, we've got the Monroe Doctrine. You need to negotiate with Venezuela. Now, in those negotiations, the British got 90% of what they wanted. So the United States felt like it was protecting Venezuela. It was really just making sure that the colonial power had its beak wet. Oil wasn't the big deal then. It was gold and some other things. And we can, go through the Roosevelt corollary and everything else that happens there. But why don't we, before we get too far down the history rabbit hole, let's just say for the listeners, unless you've been living under a rock, Pete Hegseth said last week there's a U.S. aircraft carrier battle group being dispatched to the Caribbean.
What is the name of this machinery that is coming to our seas in the Caribbean? It's like the biggest boat that the U.S. has is bringing it from Croatia to Venezuela.
Yeah. It's one of the most advanced of the U.S. carrier battle groups, and it's accompanied by all of the supporting craft around it. There was already a Marine Expeditionary Unit that was ready to go in the region. We've apparently been flying B-1 and B-52 bombers from Louisiana. I hear the fighter jets all the time here flying around, but apparently we've just been doing drive-bys with the bombers to intimidate them. And there's also tens of thousands of troops, according to reports, whether they're based in Puerto Rico or based in the region in general. So the U.S. is banging the drum for war. I will say, I said this on my most recent podcast with Marco. Usually, one carrier battle group is a PR statement. 2 carrier battle groups means you're starting to get serious, and 3 means you're going in. So we're at DEFCON 1, if that's sort of your scale here. But then you put in that into context with the Marine Expeditionary Unit and the bombers, and also maybe the United States has a mistaken impression of how strong or how weak Venezuela. I mean, there's lots to get to here. So why don't I gave a smattering of context, Elo. What are you thinking about U.S.-Venezuela relations right now? We can back into everything else from there.
First, I want to connect with the idea of the colonial instincts of the US. And I think that you are right. I sent you a few days ago a video of the West Wing in a conversation between President Bartlett and this fantastic character, which is Lord John Marbury, right? Who was this caricaturization of this lord that has this political instinct, so realist, but at the same time is always drunk and it's always trying to make English jokes that only President Bartlett understands within this institutional approach that the US has to government. So I think that what is happening right now is the worst case of the Lord John Marbury fusion with the US bureaucracy. So what you have is the colonial instinct that is not classy in British terms, but it is completely vulgar and obvious and evident. And I will always let you know that I'm trying to be the empire. So I think that is what is happening with Trump. And actually, there was one moment and I realized that there is this admiration to the British Empire, which is when Donald Trump was in a press conference with the Prime Minister of the UK. And the best joke that Trump could have was an apology to his accent. It's like Donald Trump loves the British accent. He loves the British monarchy. So I think that is an aspiration, but an aspiration in a very US way, in terms that it is not necessarily classy, but very efficient and transactional, right? So I think that is what is happening. And now let's land this in Venezuela, in the Caribbean, which is also, you have another layer there, which is what we have discussed before, the backyard of the US approach to Latin America that is coming back. Right? We are the backyard, and the US needs to keep these savages in control because they cannot control themselves. The idea of what they cannot control right now are at least 2 things: migration and drugs, right? And with both of them comes the idea of crime, which is drugs, migration. They come together to the US to do crime. So based on this rationale, this empire approach to the backyard of these animals who cannot control themselves, and this idea of animals is very relevant because it has to do with the historical racism that the US has as a whole. And that is why they don't give a fuck if they kill Latin Americans in boats, and they cannot really prove to the world that they are at least kingpins, criminals threatening the US. Because they are not military bodies, we know that. They are traffickers, but we don't know if they were the fisher in the last portion of the chain of drugs, who maybe they are trying to survive, and they are just bombing them, and nobody cares. There are Latin Americans who are fishing there, or they're dealing with drugs. What the fuck? So I think that all these layers are here together. And hey, I am not usually a fan of seeing a colonization approach to everything that is happening. I think that we also need to be accountable of our failures and not blaming colonial history to what we do in Latin America. But I think that now this tension comes to the surface in a relevant way. Now, do you want to say something?
Well, I want to set you up though, also for like, what do you think about this as relates to U.S. politics, and then I want to go back at you a little bit.
Yes, I think that. Thank you, because we have discussed this. I think that there are two different roads that are coming in parallel, and at some point they will come together. For some people, this is conceptual and political acrobatics in terms of analysis, but this is my point. I think that within the US, there is a narrative that we Latin Americans or Latino people here who are undocumented are criminals. And they have to be expelled from this country. And they have to be brutally expelled from this country. And they have to go first to these facilities that I call concentration camps, because there are no rights for them in those places. There are no rights. And that is precise. I had a conversation with someone who was there and who met a person who had to be resuscitated twice because he had a respiratory problem, and he was thrown back to these places. And he was saying, even the devil does not want me in his place. So this is a Nobel's quotation. So in this context, you have criminals in the US that need to be expelled, and you have Latin America exporting drugs and criminals to the US. So it is not very difficult to see that at some point, these two lines will cross together within the idea of war. War 2.0. Latin American cartels, Latin American drugs are the enemy that we have to attack, but not only them, also the governments that are allowing them to work. So in this situation, those who are there and those criminals who come from there and are within our country are the enemy. So we do not have only an external enemy, but we also have this external enemy within our boundaries. So the war is happening outside and inside. And because it is happening also inside, we need to rule an emergency situation. And this emergency situation could eventually lead to an extension or the attempt to extend the government for a few more years.
Yeah, there's so much to break apart there. And I want to give a couple of things that support your argument, and then I want to give an alternate explanation. The first is I was listening to Van Jackson's podcast, or a Van Jackson appearance on another podcast. Van was on our podcast a couple months ago, and he talked about this conflict with Venezuela and the deployment of these troops as, I'll quote him, excuses for emergency politics. And I thought that was a really succinct way of saying it. And it goes back to something you've been saying since the beginning of the year, looking at Peronism and Argentina as a model for what's happening in U.S. politics. One of the things about Peron was that everything was an emergency. And if you can prove that everything, or if you can convince people that everything is an emergency, then the executive gets emergency powers. I think also this is where you talked about the lines meeting between migrants and between war with Latin America. There's a line there with the emergency powers versus the government shutdown, which is we're now getting into November. Doesn't seem like the government shutdown is ending anytime soon. And conspiracy Jacob will put on his hat and say, I think Trump likes it this way, because I think when the government is shut down, he has fewer people who are throwing roadblocks for some of the things that he wants to do.
But why do you think it's conspiracy?
Well, just because I have no,
Is he,
I have no
is he
firm,
doing that? Is he? There are facts. Is he doing anything to get out of this road?
No, I would still call it an inference because I don't have the receipts. I can't prove it. So I
Okay.
call it a conspiracy because it's an inference. And I
It's
feel like
a speculation. I agree, but it is not conspiracy.
Well, it could be both. These things are not mutually exclusive. I also think if you look at the poll numbers for the Trump administration, the poll numbers have turned against the Trump administration on the management of the economy. But where poll numbers have been strong for them, to your point, are on dealing with immigration, dealing with drugs, dealing with cartels. So I think all of these things buttress your point. I do, however, want to give an alternate explanation. And it may not be alternate. It may be happening at the same time that what you're talking about is happening. And in that sense, these two lines will also converge. But I blocked off a little bit of time this morning to look at what's been happening between the U.S. and Venezuela so far this year, because at face value, this makes no sense to me. This is sort of pushing together the greatest hits of the Second Iraq War and the Bay of Pigs into one, emerging, completely predictable clusterfuck that's coming down the door. Like, you would think that it would be very easy to see that this is not a good idea the way it is being framed.
Okay, but it is Cuba with the most important reserve of oil in the world.
Yes, and Venezuela has we're always looking for El Dorado in Latin America. You're right. There are the savages that have to be civilized, and they also have to be separated from the resources that they're sitting on top of. And only the U.S., with its technology and machinery and everything else, can do that. But I think I don't know if we should call it the Trump administration, or I've struggled with where to locate this. But at the beginning of the year, the Trump administration overall was pushing for negotiations with Venezuela. And Richard Grenell, I believe is his name, was the special U.S. envoy who was negotiating with Venezuela at the start of the year. And you might remember there was a release of some U.S. prisoners in return for the U.S. getting to export some Venezuelan alleged gang members, back to Venezuela. And that was the beginning of a long negotiation that progressed through the summer. And you had the New York Times reporting just a couple of weeks ago that the Maduro regime had basically offered massive concessions to the United States as part of the deal. I'm quoting the New York Times here. So under this deal, Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro offered to open up all existing and future oil and gold projects to American companies, to give preferential contracts to American businesses, to reverse the flow of Venezuelan oil exports from China to the United States, to slash all current mining contracts with Chinese, Iranian, and Russian firms. And you might have seen this. I think it was 2 weeks ago now. Somebody asked Donald Trump at an event if Maduro had really given all these concessions, and Trump cursed in front of the cameras. He said, yes, he gave us whatever the fuck we wanted. Like, he's done it all. Now, the thing that is confusing here, though, is that, okay, Venezuela has at least signaled that it wants to give the United States everything. Like, if you're the colonial power and you don't have to fire a shot in order to get all of the oil and all of the concessions and to export all your migrants and everything else, you would think that's a good idea. But enter stage left Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio and his neoconservatism and his, right-wing Cuba background. He was banging the drum on the Panama Canal from his first day in office. He has taken over the national security role in addition to the Secretary of State role. And you have the USA Today, which did some really great reporting in an article that was just published earlier this morning. We're recording October 30th. We won't sit on this for that long, but about how Rubio was able to, quote unquote, reframe the issue for Trump by changing the focus on democracy and regime change to a focus on drug trafficking and criminality. And that there are parts of the U.S. government that are completely confused by the U.S. about face on Venezuela, who think, wait, we got them. We got the oil. We got them to say they'll give up the China, Russia, Iran relations. We got them to bend the knee and do everything that we wanted. And now we're pushing the envelope even further because there's another faction within the government that just wants Maduro to go down. And Rubio supported this in the first Trump administration, too. You might remember the aborted support of Juan Guaido, and we're going to recognize Guaido as the official Venezuelan president, and that's going to open up funding to the Venezuelan opposition that will then be able to overthrow Maduro. That, of course, didn't work. But Rubio was behind that, too. He's been pushing this for quite some time. So in addition to what you're talking about, I think there's an internal bureaucratic fight within the Trump administration. I think Trump's impulse, as it is with all things, is he wants the deal. He wants to say that he got to make the deal and it's the best Trump deal and he's the best negotiator. But he's empowered Marco Rubio to say, well, this is not actually what we want. What we really want to do is overthrow Maduro. And if you want to do that, we have to start the military pressure campaign and we have to start funding the opposition and all these other things that are happening. So tell me if you think that is that an alternate? Is it happening at the same time? Does it complicate what you're thinking? Because it does seem like there is, like, this is a Rubio project that Rubio is trying to push through. And the one thing about Trump, if Trump decides that quote unquote little Marco is not going to get to play with his toys anymore, he will send little Marco to bed without his supper. If he gets the deal that he wants. So I'm wrestling with what's going on there, because that makes a heck of a lot more sense than using U.S. military power to try and enforce regime change inside of Venezuela.
Okay, let's see the different layers of this onion. Beyond my conspiracy theory about the U.S. trying to extend its power, or Trump is trying to extend his power in the U.S. for more years, it is more complex than that, and I agree. And the Marco Rubio factor is fundamental to this conversation.
Uh-huh.
Now, let's keep the metaphor of the colony, if a metaphor it is. And maybe the tension that you're describing, that I agree exists, is like, what kind of colony I want to be? Do I want to be a British colony that it's very transactional and I don't care about the local values? Or I want to be a Spaniard colony that it's also about exporting my values, exporting religion in this case?
Uh-huh.
Why I'm saying this? Because, as you said, Trump is about deals. It's about transactions. It's about I give, I receive. But maybe the other side, in the case of Rubio, is, well, we also need to export our conservative values to Latin America. And that is why the relationship with Milei is important, because it is a fundamental ally, a key partner to export our values in South America, because we will have elections in the Andean region, and there will be a wave towards the right. I think that Bolivia has started, but Bolivia is easy because everything that would win to mass to the previous political party of Evo Morales would be on the right. So Rodrigo Paz, who is the new president of Bolivia, is someone who is more centrist. But we expect Colombia, Peru, and Chile to become maybe to the right. So it means that there is a project, or part of this project that we're trying to understand would be not only to make transactions with Latin America in order to get their resources, but it also comes with the idea of exporting our conservative values. That said, where these two approaches come together, with the idea that the more to the right the governments are, the more likely it will be to make these deals. And that is a moment when they both connect, as you can see with with Argentina, in contrast to Colombia, with a president who is constantly confronting the US. Now, Venezuela is a cornerstone in this process, because Venezuela, it is a leftist dictatorship that I think we cannot discuss, that are the leaders of the cartel. So I think that we have to agree with the Trump government that Maduro and his generals are the leaders of the cartel. And they are the leaders of the cartel who are making money not only from inefficiently extracting the oil, that I agree that the US could do it better, and they are while making money from drugs and other illegal crimes. So that said, Venezuela is important, I think, for resources, but at the same time, to transmit the idea to the region that there are some values that matter for the US. And this comes together with another layer in this onion, which is the Nobel Prize to Maria Corina Machado. Because everybody knows that the only trophy that Trump does not have when comparing himself with Obama is the Nobel Prize. And arguably, that is why he wants the Nobel. So he's trying to do small deals wherever he can. Really, I think in his mind, he really thinks he's solving a historical conflict. But those who have studied conflict and peace, like me, in my master's degree, we know that, and you that who have studied Israel for a while, we know that history is not solved in a transactional deal one day. Maybe you de-escalate. I think that is what Donald Trump is doing. He's de-escalating tensions temporarily. So let's go back. So Maria Corina Machado was a message. Was a message in two ways. The first one is, if you want to get the Nobel Prize, Venezuela matters, and regime change matters. Okay? So the paradox is like, you are going to solve a dictatorship problem abroad while becoming a dictator inside. That's
well, and also the idea that you will purchase support for your Nobel Prize resume with use of a U.S. carrier battle group. There's also a rich irony there as well.
Yes. I don't know. I think that I would like to know how much it costs having one day this warcraft in the Caribbean. So that's it.
Probably a lot. And also, just for the listeners, if you haven't been following internal Venezuelan politics, Machado is the current leader of the Venezuelan political opposition. She received a Nobel Peace Prize for her work to try and bring down the Maduro regime, which she has not been able to do thus far.
And there was this conversation internally in Latin America. When you wake up at 8 a.m. and you see that Maria Corina receives the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, and it came back to Latin America after Santos solved the peace agreement of a 50 years guerrilla in Colombia. So it is important. And because she used all the democratic ways, that the democratic means that she could, to really confront the Venezuelan dictatorship. So she is now hidden somewhere in the Venezuelan soil, on the Venezuelan soil, or below the Venezuelan soil. So all to say that Maria Corina is a message. It's a message that this region matters, that Venezuela matters, that regime change matters. And I think that Donald Trump heard that. And he's like, hey, so you, Marco Rubio, are telling me that politics also matters and not only deals. And politics could give me the Nobel Prize? Let's see this seriously, right? Everything again comes back to Trump's ego, right? So, which is at the end what moves all the machineries that we are seeing in the world right now.
Yeah. Well, there's two things I want to say to that, because, and this next one really will be a conspiracy theory, but it's part of trying to infer what the Trump administration is doing foreign policy wise. I also said this on a recent podcast with Marco, but if you're thinking about a U.S. military buildup in this part of the world, maybe it's misdirection. Maybe they're talking about Venezuela, but they actually know that they have a deal with Venezuela. It looks like a credible threat, so it allows people to take the focus off. But there are two other distinct, well, you could even say three other distinct goals the Trump administration has talked about in this part of the world. The first is the Mexican drug cartels, which kind of hard to imagine this is a wind-up for that, especially in the context of how good U.S.-Mexico relations have been. You probably saw that Claudia Sheinbaum negotiated an extension on tariffs with Trump. That's in sharp distinction to U.S.-Canada relations. There's also been the talk about retaking the Panama Canal, which Marco Rubio has also fanned the flames of. And then we brought it up a little bit, but don't forget that Cuba is still sitting there with a leftist dictatorship of itself. And which has seen some popular unrest in recent years, rising inflation. They actually just got hit with a Category 5 hurricane too. Maybe it's misdirection and maybe it's about doing something else while everybody else is looking in a different direction. I think that, I don't think that that's likely, but I've been crafting that little inference and seeing where it goes. But if we just take it on its face, I don't think that Trump is going to pull the trigger then, because I don't think Trump is at his core a neocon. I don't think he cares about these things. I think Rubio cares about them very deeply. And if Trump does pull the trigger here, he will meet the same end as all U.S. neocon leaders going back to the second Bush administration have faced, which is they will fail. You cannot transmit U.S. values at gunpoint. Like, I don't know how many times the neocons need to see this movie play out, whether it's in Afghanistan or in Iraq or any of the other places that the U.S. has intervened when neocons have been at the helm. So if the neocon push is successful here, and if Rubio really was able to convince Trump that he should be doing things against Venezuela because it will help him on drugs and cartels and things like that, when really Rubio's pushing that because he's a true neocon. He believes, no, we have to export democracy and liberalism to Venezuela, and we have to do it at gunpoint. And I also, this goes back to U.S. imperialism too, because our U.S. listeners probably remember the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe basically saying that Europeans could not intervene in the Western Hemisphere. That was the province of the United States to intervene. But the Roosevelt corollary, which, by the way, is articulated after a crisis in Venezuela in 1902, 1903. If you don't know your history well, I'll make it very short. Venezuela owed a bunch of money to European powers, especially Great Britain and Germany, and didn't want to pay it back. And so Britain and Germany, and I can't remember who the third European power was, but they blockaded Venezuela. And the United States was not so happy, or at least was torn with what it should do, because they have the Monroe Doctrine. But Teddy Roosevelt at the time even said, but the Monroe Doctrine means we prevent invasion from outside powers. Is a blockade an invasion? These are also civilized European states who are trying to get repaid by the savages who are not paying them their money back. And then you get the Roosevelt corollary. And the Roosevelt corollary is that it is the job of the United States to intervene in Latin American countries if they are not doing what they are supposed to do. So if you want to quote from U.S. foreign policy at the time, this is Roosevelt's Secretary of State in 1904, he said, quote, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, that is the United States, which, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, will exercise international police power. Which sounds an awful, that's not, neoconservatism isn't even alive then. That's realism and U.S. imperialism and great power competition. But you can see the way that Rubio and the neocons are trying to graft that onto their neoconservative goals and then push for this regime change that they've been pushing for since the first Trump administration haven't gotten yet. I rambled a little bit there, but the point I wanted to say, Elo, was I think you're right, of course, about Trump's ego. It would be only a blind person or a truly MAGA person would deny that Trump's ego shapes his behaviors. By the way, that's true of all presidents. I think Trump is actually just a little less superficial about his ego. It's just out there. Most presidents are also.
Let's give him something. He's more transparent.
Yeah, he's authentic. You don't get to the White House if you're not obsessed with yourself to some extent in that way. You have to think of yourself as worthy of the job and everything else. But I don't think that Trump's ego will be served by regime change in Venezuela. That's not his tack. He has, he wants to meet with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He wants to meet with all these different dictators. He doesn't care about them. He just wants to have the deals and have U.S. interests resolved at the end of the day. I think if Trump is true to his previous behavior, that he will eventually smack little Marco down. It works for him now, but I have a very, very hard time believing that Trump is going to fall into the neocon trap because Marco Rubio is doing this not so subtle push towards a neocon regime change in Venezuela. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's too optimistic, but I have to
comment about it.
Please.
So the first one is that we could have an agreement that at least right now, there is an internal discussion in the U.S. government about what kind of colony I want to be in Latin America. What kind of empire colony I want to have in Latin America, what kind of empire I want to have in Latin America. Do I want to have this transactional empire or I want to have this values-driven empire? Okay? So And this is not like a small tension, right? What kind of empire wanna be is not a small conversation, okay? So that is on the one hand. The other is that I'm surprised that you have not brought so far the elephant in the room, which is China. So because at the beginning of of the of the last century, it was Europe. Okay, Europe, keep yourself there. This is my territory. But now it is China, the real threat. So in this sense, to what extent this is also strategy to give the message that, hey, this is our territory. In other words, Doug Trump is peeing in Latin America to say, hey, this is my territory, don't come here. So, and everything that we have discussed is only an excuse to give a message to China.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why, because I think China already gave up on Venezuela. I think China is not interested in checkerboard alliances in different hemispheres, especially with countries that are basically failed states. The country that landed military aircraft today in Venezuela as a show of force to the Trump administration was not China, it was Russia. That's a Russian approach to geopolitics, to show that they have a client state in this part of the world and they can exact pain from the United States if they push too far on something like Ukraine. I think China has already completed its coup in Latin America. China's the top trading partner for Argentina and Brazil and Chile and some of these other countries that will talk about the domestic politics and how they're turning right. And maybe the United States can turn that back. But China knows that it is increasingly the economic center of gravity for the region. Even as Argentina bats its eyelashes at the United States and gets a bailout, Argentine exports go to China. Their trading relationship with China is absolutely.
But that is my point. I'm sorry for interrupting you. My point is that actually, if the China is winning the economic battle, so the US is saying, okay, we still have military power here, and placing your warcraft in the Caribbean is not only about Venezuela, it's giving a message about the region. I have my region military covered. So be careful if you are trying to do something else here.
Yeah, and I think the Chinese response to that is, okay, cool. Like, deploy your aircraft carrier in the Caribbean. We weren't doing anything in the Caribbean.
Like the picture yesterday or today in the morning with between Trump and Xi Jinping. It's like Trump being Trump, trying to express a lot, and Xi Jinping was okay.
Yeah, I mean,
what's next?
I think China only cares about aircraft carriers in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait, and they're building, so many ships and so many drones and everything else to try and make that U.S. advantage less so the closer you are. But as for what the U.S. does in the Caribbean, unless the U.S. is going to stop the flow of Chinese ships through the Panama Canal, which would be catastrophic for the global economy, I don't think China cares very much. And I'll do you one better. If you look at
how far is it located the aircraft, the warcraft in the Caribbean from Panama? How far it is?
Well, it won't be that far once it gets there. I don't know in exact.
So distance. You are in New Orleans. I am in Wisconsin. We are farther than that.
Yes,
those two.
Yeah, we are. But I think that China is, ironically, in this quote-unquote deal that the U.S. and China are agreeing to, or at least which Bessent and Trump say they have as they talk to Xi Jinping. What was the components of that deal? It was that the U.S. should be able to sell some things to China and that China will buy them, which is exactly what China has done to Latin America. Like, that's the whole strategy. Make them dependent on you economically, buy up all the things that make the economy work, whether it's shipbuilding or ports in Peru or.
That's my point. Why would you think that the US is more intelligent than China in this moment in history? So what I am saying that the US is trying to pee in Latin American Sea, it doesn't mean that they are doing the right thing. Yeah, so I don't think that the US is more intelligent than China in this moment in history, and even less about Latin America.
Yeah, I agree with that. My only point is that I think China's already cut Venezuela loose. I don't think China cares very much what happens in Venezuela. And so I don't I mean, maybe the United States thinks that by doing what it's doing with Venezuela, it's sending a message to China. But I think China is fine. If that message is going to China, you might as well be talking to the wall. I think China's uninterested. I think China has other priorities, and it's thinking differently in the context of how it deals with the Western Hemisphere. It is
Because
not.
we cannot assume that the messages that the US is telling to the world are really effective.
Yeah. And also, we should also say, Russia likes to, call itself a Eurasian power. Russia is a European colonial power itself. Modern Russia is a colonial enterprise and a European colonial enterprise and a European grafted onto a nation state. Like, it is just the same as all the others. China is not. China
It's
is
not at
not
all.
a European nation state with a history of colonizing, other countries far abroad. So it's going to deal with this. It's going to deal with Venezuela or with some of these other countries in Latin America very, very, very differently than the United States or even Russia. You can see how Russia deals with Cuba and Venezuela versus how China deals with Cuba and Venezuela. So yeah, I don't think all of this was in response to the elephant in the room is China. I think China's very happy to not be in the room. They're not in the room. They're just trading with everybody else who is in the room and laughing their way to the bank.
There is another elephant in the room, which is opposition in the US. And it is how the heck the US can move all these warcraft to the Caribbean for whatever the excuse it is, and bombing small boats that would never reach in its capacity the US coast from Venezuela to the US, that nobody knows what really is inside. Maybe cocaine, maybe nothing. Fentanyl, no way, because it comes from Mexico.
Yep.
So how the heck you can justify all this government expenditure, all this warcraft in the Caribbean, all this money only for bombing a few boats in the Caribbean, now in the Pacific? So where is the opposition? Where is the Congress? Where is the US trying to stop all this craziness? Because we don't find, after all this, how many? 40 minutes conversation, we still cannot find a very strong justification for. We went through China, we went through drugs, we went through regime change, and we still cannot find why the US is next to Venezuela with all this warcraft. So the next question is, maybe nobody cares, or nobody should care more than the US citizens that are paying for this.
I love that argument, but this is not something we can lay at the feet of Donald Trump, the first US president who did something like this, which is to say prosecuted a war without congressional approval, which is on its face illegal, was Harry Truman in the police action on the Korean Peninsula. And multiple US presidents have done this. And there's also an argument around one of the ways that Truman and other presidents argued that they had this power was because in the age of nuclear weapons, when the Soviets or other powers can evaporate you in a span of a couple of minutes with their nuclear warheads, you don't have time to go get a congressional resolution for war. The executive has to have special powers in these emergencies. That's at least some of the justification behind it. But here, I think you really have to draw a straight line, and I mean a straight line. It doesn't leave any of the presidents, from Bush to Obama to Trump 1 to Biden. They all did this. Remember, Obama has his fingerprints all over extrajudicial U.S. assassinations across the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen, using drones. Bernie Sanders still rails about this in Congress, about how the United States Congress should prevent the U.S. from doing these things in the Middle East, because there's no legal justification for it, and no Congress has ever been able to get its act together to stop or censure a president for using military force this way. So I think you raise a very important point, which is what the United States is doing. It's patently illegal. It violates not just international law, which I never put that much stock in, but it violates U.S. law, U.S. constitutional law in its face. But even when the government is not shut down, you don't have a Congress that is willing to stand up to the executive against this. And it has not been that important for the average U.S. citizen. And this, by the way, is as true today as it was when Teddy Roosevelt was doing the Roosevelt corollary. The average American in 1905, when Roosevelt is talking about these things, probably couldn't locate Venezuela on a map. I bet you today the average American couldn't
So what you're
isolate
saying is
Venezuela on a map.
fascinating, Jacob, because what you're implying when doing this argument is that actually Donald Trump is not doing anything new for the U.S. And this is the conservative argument too, which is, hey, Donald Trump is not doing anything new. He's doing what the U.S. has been doing for a while, and you Democrats have been doing for a while. So this is very important for the conversation because it is also about, hey, what is new maybe that they are doing this on Latin American territory, which is historically was treated differently. And now they are doing business as usual in Latin America. And they are still dealing on what is the best justification, ideological or practical.
Yeah, I think the only thing you can say is new is, and it's sort of new. I mean, you could also argue that it's the same. I mean, it's an expansion of the target set. So the United States has gone after non-state actors with this sort of action in the past. That's how it goes after jihadist groups and things like that. But we have not seen the United States military, on a formal way, deploy U.S. military forces to basically go to war against what they describe as cartel forces. That is somewhat new. It was the U.S. policy to use Mexico or Colombia to sell weapons.
You have to give them, the conservative, the MAGA government, the innovation.
Well,
and it's fair. They are innovating.
A little bit, but it's just a change of the target set. It's not new for the United States to attack sub-state national actors. I can't remember a time where the United States was deploying, the strongest parts of its navy to go after cartels. Like, that to me is somewhat new, but it's not that different in terms of, deploying US Navy and drone strikes against jihadist groups in Yemen. I mean, you're trading jihadist groups for drug cartels. There's not a huge difference there.
So you can argue at the same time that it is not new for the US. Maybe, again, the innovation is that you are expanding the concept to new kind of non-state actors. That what you're saying. That is the innovation, and I give them that. So the other innovation is the way that I find partners in Latin America. So in the case of what is happening with Argentina, it's like, okay, you want to be my partner now? Okay, I will give you this money and it will work. So they are buying support. They are buying loyalty. It's very realist. Come on. So on the other way, what is Paz from Bolivia, the new president-elect, doing? He's coming to the US. To do what? To ask for money. So maybe the US will say, hey, if you electorate in Latin America, vote for an ally, a partner of our ideas, transactional ideas, don't forget about ideological, they come together usually.
Yeah. Well, I wonder how you react to what I'm about to say. So try this argument on for size, because I mean, we've talked about Milei on this podcast several times in the past, and the idea that Milei is your conduit for conservative values. I mean, it is so rich with irony that I almost can't stand it. But I wonder if this really has nothing to do with Milei and has everything to do with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. And so let's give the listeners a little sketch of what's going on in your own country. Of Peru. Dina Boluarte was finally ushered from office. I don't know why it took so long, Elo. Her approval ratings were literally, I'm not misspeaking here, listeners, I double checked this. She hovered between 2% and 4% approval rating for over a year. So literally,
that's 100% accurate.
Literally, like, nobody likes this woman in Peru, and it took a year to get rid of her. And who gets put in her place? A 38-year-old conservative guy who's talking about tackling corruption, tackling insecurity, tackling crime. His first speech, he talked about how the main enemy is the criminal gangs, and he's going to declare a war on crime. Also, some shadowy accusations of sexual assault on him back in 2024. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole, or we can if we want. You have alluded to Bolivia. Bolivia had elections. They've got this Rodrigo Paz guy Is he center? Is he right? I don't know, but he's talking about the same things. He wants, markets, and he wants security, and it's a transformative moment for all these things. I also don't know if you saw this morning that massive assault in a Brazilian favela.
120 people died in a police raid in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, and still we don't know if they were criminals, if they were neighbors. Yes, very confusing, but 120 is the deadliest police raid in recent history in Brazil.
Yeah, and that's not coming from Lula, because Lula is horrified. That's coming from Rio state governor and maybe some of the local forces there, which are more conservative exposed. So, I actually think maybe the lesson is not, I get on stage with a chainsaw and I get US billions of dollars. I think maybe the lesson is, hey, look at what that Bukele guy did in El Salvador. He wasn't so popular in the United States for a while, but what he did was he consolidated control. He got rid of, or at least defanged, the criminal element and brought them to heel under his own authority. And then, from a position of strength, because he finally gave a modicum of stability and security to the population, he waited for the winds to change in the United States, and now the United States loves El Salvador. The Trump administration loves Bukele. It's a complete 180 versus how the Biden administration treated him. So I wonder if there isn't also the Bukeleization of South American politics in some of what we're seeing. Maybe that's too strong. You tell me.
No, there's not, actually, it's what is happening. So the first show presidential act that Jose Geri, which is the name of the new president in Peru, that nobody knew him until he was elected by Congress after expelling Dina Boluarte. The first show he did was going to a prison and doing what Bukele does. Is like put inmates on their knees and show some kind of state power against these people, even if they don't have a strategy. I think that Bukele has more strategy than Jose Geri, but showing off matters. And I do agree with you, and I want to connect this with something we have discussed before. You told me once that when you went to Mexico, you asked a few people, what do you think about Trump coming and attacking the cartels? And they said, hey, that would be great. Right? So we have to think in that way about bombing boats in the Caribbean or now the Pacific Ocean too. So taking apart the conversation, important conversation of were they really cartel members, were they really transporting drugs, were they really coming to the US, taking this conversation in parentheses for a moment, in terms of political show, that is something that you were raising up a lot in these conversations, in previous conversations, I think that it's a very good show for giving the message that security matters, and that is something, this threat, that is the most important threat in Latin America, which is criminal organizations, that states, whether they don't know what to do with them, how to deal with organized crime, or they are part of the problem and partners of the organized crime, whether the case it is, there is a population, there are citizens that are desperate, and they need some message, they need any kind of solution, and it seems that force is the only solution right now, because other policies, maybe because they were not correctly implemented, maybe because they did not have time enough to implementing it, whatever is the case, it's people are desperate and they need force, they need iron fist. In this case, I do think, and I agree, that Bukele is the benchmark. I think that there are many governments, many candidates, many politicians that are trying to imitate him. That said, I do not think that these candidates, these politicians, are able to deliver in the same way, whether because of country context or because they don't have the capacity, that the political capacity that Bukele has. So because of the country context and the political capacity, I do think that this could drive to a disaster. Okay. And having the support of the US can drive, and this is the hypothesis, to a new wave of hardliners in Latin America. So, as you know, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. So, we will not have again the US supporting all these military dictators as it happened 50 years ago and so on. But we might have the US supporting hardliners, supporting people who are doing with other means the same conclusion, which is iron fist against an enemy that is blurred, but also using the same force against those who are not aligned with the government, against the opposition. What is actually what the US government is doing right now.
Yeah. We've talked about the US as an empire and US imperialism in South and Latin America. But I think the way I might characterize it is that it's a failing empire, because if what you just said is correct, first of all, Argentina will ask for many more bailouts. You're not going to solve Argentina's problems with just 40 billion. So you're going to need a lot more. And if some of these other politicians, by the way, we didn't even mention Ecuador and the things that have been happening in Ecuador, which is all part of this conversation as well, and probably will change.
An economy that is dollarized, right?
But so if all of these guys eventually or gals come to the United States looking for Milei-style deals, my sense is that the United States will not be able to keep cashing those checks, that there are limits to what the United States can do. And I guess the question I would throw at you is, let's think about the U.S. relationship with Latin and South America today versus where it was when Teddy Roosevelt first articulated the Roosevelt corollary in 1905. One of the reasons the United States could do that was because on a relative basis, even before the US really militarized and became such a global dominant power, it was so much more powerful than countries in Latin America that it could throw its weight around like that. I mean, I just finished reading The Fish That Ate the Whale, which is about a New Orleans businessman who literally hired a couple of boats in the French Quarter to go, do regime change in Honduras. And he could do that in a couple of weeks and with a couple of boats and with a couple of guns. Like, that was the relative level of power between the United States, or even business actors in the United States and the region. My sense is that today, even though the United States is still wealthier and more powerful than most of these states, that relative to 1905, these Latin American and South American states are much more powerful, that the United States can't just throw its weight around and author regime change in these countries or get whatever it wants. Do you think that, what do you think? Do you think that the U.S. relative to those powers is as strong as it was in 1905? Or do you think that the United States is cashing checks, is writing checks that it won't be able to cash, that it's actually weaker on a relative basis to these powers than it was in 1905 when it was the emperor of the Western Hemisphere?
Money matters. It will not solve all your problems, but matters. Milei received this hag plus money in the US and came back to Argentina and won an election. The US is taking money out of Colombia, and that is actually strengthening Petro. Not because necessarily the money is going out, but because Petro is using this situation to say internally that he's the only president who is really confronting Donald Trump, which is technically true. It doesn't mean that it has the consequences that he would expect, but technically he's like confronting him on Twitter.
You don't think Lula falls in that category?
So, I mean, in terms of show off, right? I think that Lula is smarter. He's using diplomacy. He's doing politics. Now we can say in these times, he's doing old school politics that it is still good politics, right? So I do agree with you. Lula is confronting, but I think the word confronting is important. Lula is negotiating. Petro is confronting. Okay. And I think that confronting has political revenues too.
Uh-huh.
Right? Negotiating is a long-term process. So that said, I think that money matters. First, I think that money matters also because Latin America, after the pandemic, has been in with different levels in an economic crisis that has been sharpening in different ways, especially for the people. We can discuss investment. Investments have a different rationale, but for people in their everyday lives, the economics are really difficult in this moment. So I think that we need market-oriented policies, stable market-oriented policies, market-oriented policies that really have a good impact in society. We need foreign investment. We need jobs. So we need good companies to have healthy lives. So in this need, I do think that the left is not necessarily solving this. Within this idea, the rightist project is giving some hope. And this is also what is happening in Argentina. So it is Milei with Trump or coming back to Peronismo, right?
Yeah.
So let's give a chance to Milei with Trump. So I would say the same with other different countries. So in this context, to answer your question, I do think that the US has, and Trump administration, to be very precise, has the capacity of influencing our countries. That said, it is not as easy as it was before. You have China in the region doing foreign investments for far more time than the US. You have governments that are stronger. You have electorate who are living in echo chambers. So there's a different context. But I still think that the US is a reference for the Latin America. And if you want to follow the US narrative, we are still the backyard.
Okay. Elo, I could talk to you for 3 hours. We're coming up on time. So we're not going to solve all the questions here, but let's land the plane. What is your key takeaway, at least from this conversation, or what is the thing that you want the listeners to take away for now?
So I think that there is something happening in Venezuela that it's important to be aware of how it evolves, because we still are trying to figure out why the US government is trying to engage so hardly and heavily with Venezuela. I just interviewed Lucas Peña for my podcast, and he told me that the drug excuse is actually for a change of regime in Venezuela. That's a possibility. But at the same time, we can also argue that we don't know what is going to happen, and the US is investing a lot there. And we have to see that how, in the short and long run, will impact domestic politics in the US. So that is the first message. The second message is we have to keep seeing how Latin America moves towards the right in the next cycle. In Argentina, it's strengthening its position. In Chile, in Peru, and in Colombia, there will be elections in this and the next year. In Bolivia, already you have something that is closer to the right, very pragmatic, trying to make a deal with the United States. And this will have different consequences. It will have an impact on politics, and it will have an impact on economy. So those who are seeing Latin America as a possibility to invest, actually, this is the moment to foresee what will happen the next year. Stakes in Argentina and from Argentina went high the next day of the elections. So, but at the same time, maybe this is good for the markets, but not necessarily for the people, if it will create more tensions, more conflict, and will not necessarily trickle down into people's lives.
Yeah, and I think that's well said. And I think the only thing I want to add to it is usually in geopolitical analysis, Latin America gets treated as fairly boring and not much is changing. But I mean, as I hope we've made the case here, I mean, there's the US-Venezuela locus, but everywhere you look, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, like all of these countries are in tremendous flux. And some of that is in response to policy volatility out of the White House. Some of that is in response to US-China trade negotiations. Some of that is just domestic politics. There is so much, like, yeah, don't ignore it. Like, change is happening here. This is not a region that we think of changing or as super volatile or super dynamic. It's incredibly dynamic right now. And I hope that at least us trying to talk out some of these questions that we have was useful for the listeners.
And there is one more thing that I want to say to finish.
Please.
It is like, I think, and we have not discussed this, unlike previous times, I think that the flow of information and the flow of ideas, it's not only coming from the US to Latin America, but also from Latin America to the US. So the first to use the chainsaw against the government was not the US, was Milei.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro was there almost at the same time with the first Trump. So Bukele is an example of showing off a iron fist and a strong security even before the US was trying to do something similar. Now it's becoming a partner.
And also, by the way, Bitcoin, like, which the United States is also embraced.
So I think that there is also a way back. I don't know if it's a way back. Actually, it's a first stone, a first keystone from Latin America in many ideas that we have been discussing, and that also matters. And that is why, as one interviewee said before, we are witnessing what he calls the rightist international, right? And this rightist international is not, evidently the US is the leader because it is the leader in many things, but at the same time, it is more multipolar than we could think.
All right, Elo, we'll pick it up there next time. All right, my friend, stay safe out there.
Have a good one. Bye.